Today, I want to take you through a very simple yet incredibly powerful practice. It's something that neuroscientists, psychologists, and high performers alike have understood for years: the importance of setting the tone of your internal state first thing in the morning. You see, every day when we wake up, our brain is in a unique physiological condition. When the levels of cortisol are naturally elevated, your neurochemistry is primed for pattern recognition, and the mind is at its most suggestible. The thoughts you entertain in those first few minutes don't just shape your mood. They physically alter the state of your brain and nervous system, influencing how you perceive, react to, and remember the events of your day. Today, I want to give you 5 precise, actionable phrases, 5 things to tell yourself every morning designed to harness these natural brain states and neurochemical windows to literally transform the trajectory of your day. This isn't motivational fluff. These are tools grounded in clinical neuroscience, performance psychology, and behavioral physiology. You'll use your own biology to your advantage. There's an extraordinary property of the human brain that's often overlooked in day-to-day life. It's the fact that your brain, at its core, is a prediction machine. It filters the billions of bits of sensory information it encounters every second and selects, often unconsciously, what you notice and what you ignore. This filtering system is called the reticular activating system, or RAS. It's a bundle of nerves located at the base of your brainstem, and it acts like the gatekeeper for your conscious awareness. What's crucial is that this system takes its cues from what you consciously decide to focus on. In essence, the things you repeatedly think about and declare important become the categories your RAS tags as significant. When you wake up in the morning, your brain is in a neurobiological state characterized by heightened plasticity. Your levels of cortisol, which often gets a bad rap but is essential for alertness and focus, are at their natural peak within the first 30 to 45 minutes after waking. This hormonal and neurochemical window makes your mind especially susceptible to suggestion, intention, and reorganization of focus. If you do not consciously choose where to direct your attention, the default settings of your brain, typically worry, reactivity, or survival-based thinking, will fill the void. This is why it's critical to start your day by asserting dominion over your attention. When you say to yourself, "Today, I control what I focus on," you're not making a passive affirmation. You're engaging the top-down attentional control systems of your prefrontal cortex, the area of your brain responsible for executive functions like decision-making, planning, and regulating emotional responses. By setting this intentional statement first thing in the morning, you're essentially priming your neural networks for selective attention, which then influences your perception of every subsequent event. Focus is not just about what you pay attention to, it's also about what you deliberately choose to ignore. Neuroscience teaches us that attention is a limited resource, often compared to a spotlight. At any given moment, you can only consciously process a small fraction of the sensory inputs you're exposed to. When you intentionally decide, "I will focus on progress today, not obstacles," you direct the spotlight of your attention to information, cues, and opportunities that support that narrative. Your brain will begin tagging those instances as relevant, making them more visible to your conscious mind. Conversely, distractions and perceived threats become less salient. You might think of this as calibrating the lens through which you'll interpret everything that happens to you for the rest of the day. Every interaction, every email, every challenge will either be filtered through the lens of intentional focus or the default lens of unconscious reactivity. And this distinction profoundly affects not only your productivity, but also your subjective well-being. There's also an energetic component to attention. Cognitive energy, the mental bandwidth you have for focusing, problem-solving, and decision-making, is finite. Researchers have shown that decision fatigue, a phenomenon where your ability to make high-quality choices diminishes after prolonged periods of decision-making, is directly tied to the depletion of attentional resources. By deciding early in your day where your attention will go, you reduce cognitive load and preserve mental energy for meaningful tasks. You essentially preemptively structure your day's cognitive economy, allocating resources to the areas most aligned with your values and objectives. An important nuance here is the difference between passive attention and directed focus. Passive attention is what happens when you wake up, pick up your phone, and start scrolling through news feeds or social media. Your brain reacts to whatever stimuli it encounters, reinforcing a state of external dependency for emotional state regulation. Directed focus, on the other hand, is the conscious act of deciding what thoughts, sensations, and experiences you will prioritize. This act of metacognition, thinking about what you're thinking about, is one of the most powerful cognitive tools available to you. It transforms you from a passive participant in your day to an active architect of your experience. The simple act of starting your day with the statement, "Today, I control what I focus on," isn't just psychological conditioning, it's physiological recalibration. You're signaling to your body and brain that you are prioritizing coherence between your internal state and external demands. This creates a feedback loop where intentional focus reinforces productive behaviors, and those behaviors in turn generate experiences that validate your initial intention, creating what psychologists call a self-fulfilling prophecy loop, grounded in cognitive behavioral dynamics. Attention also shapes memory. The events and stimuli you attend to are the ones your brain tags for consolidation during sleep, especially during slow wave and REM sleep cycles. When you consistently direct your attention toward constructive, growth-oriented narratives, you bias your memory systems to prioritize those experiences, reinforcing adaptive mental models over time. This means the simple morning practice of declaring intentional focus doesn't just affect your day, it rewires how your brain encodes and recalls life itself. In practical terms, this could manifest in small but profound ways. You might notice a productive conversation that previously would have gone unappreciated. You might identify a solution to a problem you'd been unconsciously avoiding. You might experience a moment of gratitude that would have otherwise been overshadowed by stress. These moments compound, and over weeks and months, they change the story you tell yourself about your life, your potential, and your place in the world. When you say, "Today I control what I focus on, and where I place my attention is where my life moves," you are literally deciding the vector of your day, the direction in which your attention, energy, and ultimately your identity will move. It is an act of both neurological conditioning and personal agency, one that elevates you from a responder of circumstance to a creator of your lived experience. The biological mechanism supporting this is known as neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on where it directs attention and repeated mental activity. Every time you refocus your mind on a particular thought pattern or objective, you strengthen the neural pathways associated with that pattern. This is Hebbian learning. Neurons that fire together wire together. When you repeatedly tell yourself in the morning, "Where I place my attention or where my life moves," you condition your neural circuits to identify alignment between your thoughts, actions, and outcomes. Over time, your perception of circumstances shifts, not because the world objectively changes, but because your cognitive filters recalibrate what you consider important, actionable, or valuable. If we were to look at the human brain from an evolutionary standpoint, its primary function has always been survival. Every neural circuit, from the ancient structures of the brainstem to the higher order reasoning of the prefrontal cortex, evolved to keep us alive in an environment filled with unpredictable, often dangerous circumstances. But what modern neuroscience has revealed is that the same structures responsible for detecting threats can also be rewired to perceive opportunities. And that ability, that flexibility, is what we now refer to as resilience. Resilience is not the absence of stress or adversity. It is the biological, psychological, and behavioral capacity to encounter difficulty, and use it as a stimulus for growth and adaptation. And you tell yourself each morning, my challenges are opportunities in disguise, priming me for resilience. You're not just offering yourself a motivational phrase. You are actively intervening in the neural processes that govern how you appraise stress and adversity. Stress at its core is not an event. It's your brain's interpretation of an event. Two individuals can experience the exact same external circumstance and have vastly different internal responses. The difference is the meaning assigned to the experience. And meaning is determined by cognitive framing, the lens through which you perceive difficulty. In neuroscience, one of the key mechanisms involved in resilience is called cognitive reappraisal. This is the ability to reinterpret a potentially negative or threatening experience in a way that reduces its emotional impact and opens up pathways for constructive action. Functional MRI studies have shown that when individuals engage in reappraisal, there's increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for executive functions like planning, decision-making, and impulse control, and decreased activation in the amygdala, which governs fear and threat detection. What this tells us is that resilience isn't a fixed trait, it's a learned skill, and it's developed through the repeated practice of reframing challenges as opportunities for growth. One of the most biologically significant aspects of adversity is that it primes the nervous system for adaptation. When the brain encounters a stressor, it initiates a cascade of physiological responses: increased heart rate, elevated cortisol levels, enhanced blood flow to muscles, all of which are designed to prepare the organism for action. But what's often overlooked is that these same physiological changes also prime the brain for neuroplasticity. Adversity creates a state of heightened alertness and focus, conditions under which the brain is more capable of forming new neural connections. In other words, stress opens a window for learning and behavioral change, provided that the individual can shift their cognitive framing from threat to challenge. Research on stress inoculation, a process by which controlled exposure to manageable stress enhances future resilience, demonstrates that individuals who repeatedly encounter and overcome difficulty build stronger, more adaptive stress response systems. Their baseline levels of stress hormones decrease, recovery times improve, and they develop enhanced problem-solving abilities under pressure. This is not hypothetical theory. It's been validated in studies ranging from military training environments to clinical therapy settings to elite athletic performance programs. The body's capacity to adapt to stress is one of its most essential survival tools, and it operates on a principle known as hormesis, the idea that low to moderate doses of a potentially harmful stimulus can produce beneficial adaptive effects. Telling yourself each morning that your challenges are opportunities is a way of activating this principle on a cognitive level. You begin to expect that adversity will occur because it always does, but instead of instinctively resisting it, you lean into it as a source of growth. This shift changes your baseline physiological response to stress. Studies have shown that individuals who view stress as enhancing rather than debilitating exhibit improved cardiovascular function, increased focus, and better task performance under pressure. This is partly because their bodies produce more DHEA, a hormone that counteracts some of the damaging effects of cortisol and supports neural growth and repair. There's also a critical link between resilience and neurochemistry. One of the neurotransmitters most heavily involved in stress and adversity is norepinephrine. Often associated with the fight or flight response, norepinephrine heightens alertness and increases the brain's capacity to detect salient information. But what's fascinating is that when individuals adopt a challenge mindset, perceiving difficulty as an opportunity, the release of norepinephrine is paired with increased dopamine activity, especially in brain regions associated with motivation and reward. This biochemical pairing creates a state in which adversity is not merely tolerated, but actively engaged with, because the experience itself becomes intrinsically rewarding. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the molecule of pleasure, But what it truly governs is the anticipation of future reward. When your brain interprets a challenge as a potential source of growth or achievement, it releases dopamine in anticipation of overcoming that challenge. This neurochemical feedback loop reinforces adaptive behaviors and enhances motivation, even in the face of discomfort or difficulty. It's a biological mechanism for resilience. The brain rewards itself for persistence in adversity. What this means practically is that every time you encounter difficulty, you have a split-second window in which to decide how to interpret it. If you frame it as a threat, your body's stress systems will activate in a way that prioritizes avoidance and defensiveness. If you frame it as an opportunity, those same systems prepare you for focus, goal-directed action. The event itself doesn't change, your cognitive appraisal does, and with it, your neurochemical and physiological state follows. This is why morning is the ideal time to prime this mindset. In those first moments after waking, your brain is highly plastic and highly suggestible. The narratives you establish in that window set the tone for how you'll interpret every subsequent event of the day. If you've conditioned yourself to believe that challenges are inherently negative, your brain's threat detection systems will remain hypervigilant, scanning for problems and interpreting ambiguity as danger. But if you've rehearsed the belief that challenges are opportunities in disguise, your brain will filter those same events as stimuli for growth, problem solving, and personal development. This belief isn't just psychological armor, it's a literal recalibration of your autonomic nervous system. People who consistently view adversity as opportunity exhibit higher levels of parasympathetic nervous system activity during stress recovery. This means their bodies return to a state of calm and balance more quickly after a stressor. High-performance athletes, military operators, and elite professionals in high-stakes fields routinely train this capacity, not by avoiding stress, but by confronting it repeatedly while maintaining cognitive control over its interpretation. Another biological mechanism at play here is neurogenesis, the growth of new neurons, particularly in the hippocampus, a brain region critical for memory, learning, and emotion regulation. Studies have shown that moderate, manageable stress can stimulate neurogenesis, while chronic, overwhelming stress suppresses it. The determining factor between these two outcomes is largely cognitive framing. When adversity is seen as manageable and purposeful, the body interprets it as a growth stimulus rather than a threat, triggering adaptive neural changes rather than pathological ones. It's also essential to understand that resilience is domain general. This means that the capacity you build by overcoming adversity in one area of life generalizes to others. The stress resilience adaptations you develop by persisting through professional challenges, for example, enhance your capacity to manage emotional stress, physical strain, and even relational conflict. The reason is that the underlying neural and hormonal systems that govern stress response are largely the same across different contexts. So when you tell yourself that today's challenges are opportunities, you're not just preparing to handle work problems or interpersonal conflicts. You're strengthening a global neural network of resilience that will serve you in every domain of your life. Moreover, this mindset has profound implications for self-efficacy, the belief in your ability to exert control over your circumstances and outcomes. High self-efficacy is one of the most reliable predictors of mental health, achievement, and life satisfaction, and it's built in large part by accumulated evidence. Every time you confront a challenge and reframe it as an opportunity, you add another data point to your internal model of competence and capability. Over time, this shifts your baseline assumptions about what you can handle, making you more proactive, more optimistic, and more willing to engage with uncertainty rather than avoid it. In the broader scope of brain-body interaction, one can look at how these mental frameworks influence not just neural circuitry, but immune function, cardiovascular health, and endocrine regulation. The interpretation of stress as a growth stimulus versus a threat has measurable effects on inflammatory markers, blood pressure, and hormonal cascades. The mind-body connection is not metaphorical. It's physiological, biochemical, and systemic. And so the act of telling yourself each morning, my challenges are opportunities in disguise, priming me for resilience, is an act of biological optimization. You're choosing to engage your nervous system's most ancient survival mechanisms in service of your highest cognitive capacities. You're converting what would otherwise be sources of fear and avoidance into stimuli for learning, adaptation, and growth. You're literally reprogramming your brain's threat detection systems, dopamine pathways, and autonomic response patterns through deliberate, intentional cognitive framing. The human brain is an extraordinary prediction machine, constantly sampling the environment, collecting data, and using past experiences to forecast what will happen next. At the core of this predictive processing lies attention, the mechanism by which the brain selects what information to prioritize from an infinite stream of sensory input. Attention is not passive. It's an active process, and it fundamentally determines your subjective experience of reality. When you direct your focus towards something, you amplify its importance in your perceptual and emotional world. You effectively tell your brain, this is what matters. And as a result, neural circuits align, neurochemicals adjust, and your internal state shifts to accommodate that priority. Neuroscientifically, focus is governed by a network of brain regions, often referred to as the attentional control network. This involves the prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive functions and conscious decision-making, and the parietal lobes, which help orient attention in physical and cognitive space. These areas work in concert with subcortical structures like the thalamus, which acts as a relay center for sensory information, determining which signals gain access to conscious awareness. Every moment of the day, this system is filtering out the vast majority of sensory input and allowing in only what your brain deems relevant based on what you've trained it to notice. This is why the belief, I control my focus and my focus shapes my reality, is not a metaphor or a motivational platitude. It's a neurological fact. Wherever you direct your attention, you're reinforcing specific neural pathways while pruning away others. The brain operates on the principle of use-dependent plasticity. The circuits you use most often become stronger and more efficient, while those you neglect weaken and fade. This is how habits, skills, and mindsets form over time. And it begins with conscious control over where you place your attention. Focus is also intimately linked with neurochemical systems, particularly those involving acetylcholine, dopamine, and norepinephrine. Acetylcholine is released in the brain when attention sharpens on a particular object, idea, or task. It acts like a spotlight, enhancing the signal-to-noise ratio in the relevant neural circuits and suppressing irrelevant inputs. This allows for deeper concentration, faster learning, and improved memory consolidation. When you decide each morning to consciously control your focus, to choose what matters to you before the chaos of the world imposes its own priorities, you activate this cholinergic system in a way that primes your brain for efficient, goal-directed behavior.